Okay, hello and welcome everybody. Thanks so much for being here. So great to have everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, evening, wherever you might be. I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Smriti Mehta. I am at UC Berkeley. I'm the co-chair of the HxA Academy campus community over here. And I'll introduce Jenara, and then we'll just go into a discussion, Jenara and I'll ask her some questions. That will go on for 40 minutes, and then we will go on to Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can save them, put them in the chat, or ask them, raise your hand and ask them at the end. Um, so let me introduce Jenara. Jenara is an author, journalist, and public speaker who lectures widely on neuroscience, innovation, leadership, and diversity, including viewpoint diversity. She holds a degree from Harvard School of Public Health and also UC Berkeley. Her writing has been featured in Time, NPR, the NBC, and CNN, and she writes for Fast Company magazine and the UC Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center magazine. She's the founder of the Neurodiversity Project and the author of the best-selling book, The Divergent Mind. And her new book, which we're here to discuss today, is called Trust Your Mind, Embracing Nuance in a World of Self-Silencing. And it's about the psychology of groupthink. So Jenara, thanks so much for being here. I really enjoyed reading your book, and I'm excited to discuss it.
Thank you so much for having me. Big fan of HxA Academy, and I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you.
Yeah, me too. So let me start by, so I was recently with a friend and I had the book with me because I was reading it, and he asked me about it and I said I'm, doing a book talk with Jenara, and he read the title and he was like, but we shouldn't trust our minds. And I was like, I guess there's something to that. And so, in the spirit of embracing nuance and also, a constructive disagreement, let me just put this out there. I think, given what you have, you do research in psychology, you've written about it. My background is in psychology. Given all that we know about, cognitive biases and how we are sort of maybe, evolved with tribal tendencies, maybe there is something to be said about not trusting our minds too much and maybe, you know, not taking ourselves too seriously, or maybe having some separation between ourselves and our beliefs and our values is probably, a key to being open-minded. So what would you say to that?
Yes, love the question. I know. So, as an author, you collect like so many themes and you're like, okay, how are we gonna title this, right? And we wanted to keep mind in there, like from my first book. Um, So trusting your mind is it's like twofold, right? In terms of naming it, it's a bit of like an aspiration, right? Like how do we arrive at a place where we can trust our mind? What is the journey that you need to go on in sort of developing your own critical thinking? The other thing was that I kind of love that it was provocative for the very, point that your friend brought up. Like you should not trust your mind at all times. And, we know the mind is so prone to error. And that's why we have so many therapeutic approaches that help people sort of like fix, the errors in how they see things and what their mind is telling them and all of that. So it's sort of provocative on the one hand, but it's also aspirational. And so the book really chronicles um, how do we, kind of identify groupthink? How do we uncover it? How do we catch ourselves? How do we develop the skills to be better critical thinkers? Because it's just something that so many of us are not taught from a young age. It is demanding a lot of our education systems or even parenting. And so, yeah, trusting your mind is kind of like a destination. And Smriti, I just
Yeah.
want to check that we can see both of us because I'm only seeing myself. So I just want to make sure that.
That's because I've spotlighted you,
Okay. Okay.
and I
Perfect.
and I think that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Uh, you're the guest of honor.
Oh.
So so speaking about, yeah, education, and this is something I think that really stood out to me because you bring up this idea that critical thinking is so important and it's becoming even more important, but it's so hard to teach, especially as educators and people who are in this space. It's so hard to know or to figure out the right way to teach critical thinking. Like, is it something that should be a standalone thing, a standalone course or module, or should it be something that should be incorporated in all the courses? And it seems like there's a lot of uncertainty about how to actually teach critical thinking skills. So yeah, in your research, like what have you found? Are there some good strategies, or how should educators and even just, parents and people go about trying to bring it in to their work?
Yeah, I kind of stumbled into the education space a little bit as I was journeying through so many studies, like from psychology to neurology. And when I was looking at education, it seemed like there were sort of two schools of thought. There's sort of explicit modeling where you're announcing to the class, okay, here, class, this is a lesson in critical thinking. This is how you do it. These are the steps versus implicit modeling, where the sort of critical thinking is just modeled by the teacher and the questions are woven throughout. You know, if it's a lesson on history or engineering, the questions are sort of just embedded into the lesson. Um, it seems like either way, just immersing students in critical thinking seems to be sort of like the way to go, right? Or combining the two. Like it's okay to announce it, but it's also great to just kind of integrate it and model it throughout a lesson. Um, I didn't spend a ton of time on education specifically in the book. The other aspect of education in classrooms that I did look at a lot was debate. So, maybe you
Right.
saw that chapter. That was one of my favorite chapters to write because it was just so eye-opening.
It's an excellent chapter.
Thank you. It was
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah. So let me, I want to bring it back to also a point that you made early on in the beginning of the book, which is about how the culture of academia is such that there's a lot of nitpicking. You are taught and trained to, tear other people's arguments and to really go deep, into like one sentence and try to parse it and try to understand and try to argue against it. And that might be something that's leading to this culture, the cancel culture and the mob behavior of people just, piling on to others online. So that's one hand where it could lead to this sort of cancel culture mentality and trying to tear other people down. But you could also see the value on really thinking critically about whether what other people are saying, right? So there's that balance of how do you do one in a way that's respectful, where you can disagree with people respectfully and really try to understand what they're saying and also be able to make your arguments, but not fall into the trap of just trying to tear people down.
Yeah, I think it's a fine balance. I'm not an academic. I don't work in academia, but I love interviewing academics and, come from a family of academics. So it's been interesting to sort of observe the culture of academia. And then, of course, Heterodox Academy knows all about this,
Right.
sort of the state of academia right now. Um, I think that being able to break things apart, like reading through an essay and sort of like really getting critical about an argument is such an amazing skill that everyone should be taught. Where it seems to become like a little toxic is the way I see academics kind of tearing at each other, right? And that precedes all the cancel culture stuff, right? So something I talk about in the book is it's like, it kind of seemed to be like there was this cultural foundation of this what I call like nitpicking on steroids that I wonder if it sort of, lent itself to this excessive cancel culture mentality that we've been seeing on campuses for the last, 10 to 15 years. I think, probably many of us in this room want to see a very healthy culture of debate and vigor, and that's what's so exciting about the world of ideas, and that's what draws us into this space, right? As academics and journalists, thinkers and writers. And I think there's a handful of people out there who continue to do that and may have maintained that kind of culture, and I think that's beautiful, and I think that's the standard that we should hold. Um, Things just get a little odd when you just start seeing like such random things being like broken down and do we really need to analyze like this aspect of this concept or I mean maybe there's merit in that, but maybe that kind of thinking it could be possibly part of the issue when it's especially when it's combined with a power grab or jealousy or, sort of
Right,
climbing a
right.
ladder. I think that's when it gets a little dangerous.
Yeah, intentions matter, right? What's the spirit in which you're engaging in this discourse is important. So let me jump change gears a little bit. So as I was reading the book, I thought that, and maybe you disagree and you can tell me, I thought it would be most helpful and impactful for young people.
Mhm.
Um, because you're talking about sort of the pull of groupthink and forming these, identifying with these identity groups and just taking on those values and beliefs without thinking for yourself. So I thought that it would be really helpful for people, and especially college students or young people who are still trying to figure out who they are and what they believe in. And there is this pull to conform because you're still trying to figure out who you are. It's almost a little bit easier. It provides a scaffold for your identity when you can belong to a group, become part of a group, so that as you're exploring the world, as you're becoming exposed to other ideas, other viewpoints, that you have some scaffolds that will help you build your identity and build a foundation for yourself. But how would you, what advice would you give to young people where they might need it? There's a certain pull towards conformity, towards taking on others' viewpoints. When they can do that, use those scaffolds, but also not, use them as crutches and not become free thinkers.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I mean, I think so. I wrote this book because I had had my own experience, sort of like being mobbed online. That was just so bizarre and confusing, especially as a journalist, like someone who just values free speech um, and then I was really disturbed and frankly sad about the state of like online discourse when I started to see the way, Twitter at the time was no longer just like this fun, enjoyable place to share things, right? Twitter became this place to tear each other down, right?
Yeah.
So that was kind of the genesis of the book. And then I had also, I had a very unique upbringing in the heart of San Francisco with, just my family's made up of so many different religions and races and so I was also very perplexed at why I wasn't seeing, nuanced conversations being had on a wider scale when it came to like identity and demographics and things like that, right? Um, and then, yeah, just so to answer your question, I felt like I had to write this book almost for myself because I had to kind of learn how to, I didn't have debate club in school growing up. I, having been raised pretty religious, I didn't see a lot of, intense disagreement. I was very drawn to that because I was very like curious kid. I appreciated like strong arguments, but I wasn't something that I saw modeled for myself extensively. So writing the book wasn't necessarily with like, high school, college age kids in mind, but I've heard that feedback that it
Yeah.
seemed like it would be like a great sort of like pocket. Um, at the same time, I don't know. I mean, the fact that we are where we are right now in terms of the state of like self-silencing, cancel culture, people being so obsessed with what group they belong to and like these labels and identities and the way that's kind of taken hold of our national discourse kind of makes you wonder, like, to use what you're saying, like, or developmental psychology, like, are we all a little bit developmentally stunted?
Hmm.
If these kinds of core basic ideas are not widely held as like an American
Right.
public. Um, maybe it's the case that we all need to kind of get up to speed in terms of like how to do this, how to do it in a way that's constructive,
Right.
against the tide of Twitter and all the polarization and nastiness that we see online. So yeah, I don't know. It's a great question.
Yeah, no, I do worry for the next generation. I think, kids now who are in college or maybe even 4 or 5 years ago, especially after the pandemic, the culture is there's so much, yeah, I mean, self-silencing, as you say, and just I there are a few points in the book where you raise this point of how it really gets in the way of connecting authentically with people. And I think that's certainly very true, especially I think for people who've been in other cultures or been part of other, other cultures where it's so natural to just say what you think and say things sometimes bluntly and sometimes you will offend people, but that's okay. And then you make up. And I feel like so much of that is lost when you're not able to just be yourself while also being, sensitive and mindful of other people's sort of psychological realities and their needs and their motivations. So, yeah. Um,
Yeah, it's so true. I think if you have that kind of early exposure or early immersion in difference in some way, whether it's like cultural diversity or class diversity, racial diversity, and a lot of the people I interviewed in the book who are sort of rising intellectuals, there did seem to be this common pattern that somewhere early on there was an immersion in difference. Either they were mixed race, biracial, or they had spent a lot of time in another country. And so, yeah, I do think those early exposures are important. And, colleges are supposed to be one environment to kind of get that experience. Um, so remains to be seen if it'll that way.
Yeah, so speaking about other cultures, one part that really stood out to me was when you had this section on the journalist David McElhenney. Is
Hmm.
that how you say his name? Where in 2023 he wrote an article about Gwen Stefani and how she had made comments about loving Japanese culture and thinking that she feels part Asian, part Japanese because she loves the culture and how it's influenced her work. And there was a lot of backlash against that because she was accused of cultural appropriation. And there was a sentence in there which stood out to me where you say, and he's sympathetic to people feeling like they're walking around on eggshells, especially in the United States. But what he doesn't understand is how a society that fought for centuries for individual freedom and liberal democracy now prioritizes group identity, group affiliation, and groupthink. It's so unfree and bizarre, he reiterates. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot, where I feel like in the past decade, the push, maybe broadly in the culture, but definitely especially in academia, about caring about what I think are these collectivistic values of belonging, of inclusion, which are, of course, positive and good, I think, if it's done well, but almost at the expense of other values that are also important, like individualism and personal agency. I mean, I loved your section on self-determination theory. That's sort of my background is on motivation research. Um, and so I feel like there's a lot of the tensions we see are now these tensions between what I think of as sort of Western values and Eastern values. And I feel like we're just sort of struggling of combining them in a way that's constructive and healthy as opposed to, them being, pitted against each other. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's so weird because I feel like we talk so much about inclusion and belonging, right? But in this country, but it's almost now kind of being done in a militaristic way. So in that way, it's very not Eastern, right? I know you and I both have spent, I mean, you grew up in South Asia. I lived in South Asia for a long time, and I'm heading back there shortly. And my family's, half South Asian. So it is interesting to see these different value systems being adopted by one group and the experimentation there. Um, in the book, I do kind of chronicle what that was like for me, like because the first half of the book is really drawing out more individual, strain of thought, right? Like how do you break through groupthink, right? Like centering the individual. But then halfway through writing the book, I was like, well, we don't want to become so obsessed with that where we're forgetting the other stuff, right? Like I think most of us value family and friendship and, connection,
Right.
belonging, all of these things. So how do we make space for both? And what I say essentially is that it's just this constant dance and it's a constant trial and error and that it's different for every individual, right? Like there's going to be some areas of life where people are willing to compromise on certain things because that group is so important to them, and it doesn't feel like self-silencing out of fear or out of shame, but out of choice and agency, right? Like we don't have to blurt
Right.
out everything. Um, so yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts too on that.
Yeah, I'm still struggling with it. It's something I think about a lot because, as you say, of course, even value like caring about family and caring about your community is also, I think, a very important part of, Western culture, definitely American culture. But there are other, like I feel like there are excesses, there are pros and cons to each approach, right? Like even a sense of agency or individualism can lead you to maybe not seek help when you need it, right?
Hmm.
Or not reach out to people, or, this idea of self-sufficiency can be detrimental in certain cases. So I think as a culture, we're just trying to find the balance, the right balance of both these, two domains of values. But I don't know how to get there.
Yeah.
Um, but the other thing that stands out to me, I think, is there the sort of trying to get maybe especially young people, but everybody to see the value in debate and disagreement, and especially maybe like I grew up in India and in a culture, and I've heard it from other people with Asian backgrounds of there's a sense in which disagreeing with other people sometimes, especially people who maybe your elders or other people who are higher up, than you in certain hierarchies, it's almost seen it's by default disrespectful, right? You don't ask questions and you don't challenge them, and to even try to make a rational argument disagreeing with somebody is seen as disrespectful. So there's no way around it. And I'm seeing more of that now here, which is sort of disheartening.
Mm.
But to me, like this is when I was very young, my grandfather, maybe like 6 years old, my grandfather told my mother that I should be a lawyer because I just loved arguing with people. So this is something that I have always done. And to me, it's fun. I think, as you mentioned in your book, how do we get it to a place where disagreeing with people feels fun? And it is such an important part. There's there's a section in your book about Kuhn, is it Deanna Kuhn, who talks
Hmm.
about just the value of argumentation and thinking is arguing, and how it's important not just for, common discourse, but also for scientific thinking. And I think that's what we're missing, because when disagreement feels like an attack, then of course, right? So I think there's a difference in how people think about somebody disagreeing with you. And I'm not sure how we change the framing where I think you say that it's okay, you should be okay with conflict. But to me, it's like, how do we change people's mind about not thinking of it as conflict, right? If
Hmm.
I challenge what you're saying, I'm not trying to get into a fight with you. It's because that's how we get to a deeper truth or to some reality or try to understand each other. And I think that framing maybe needs to change.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's so much generative potential in the clash of ideas, right? And so if we can start to see it that way, then it's something we can actually celebrate and get excited about and look forward to. But I think broadly speaking, in at least in the US right now, I think there's a real aversion to, we can call it conflict or just disagreement or tension, right? And I see a lot of parallels there, sort of on a societal level as well as like interpersonally, right? There's so much interest, of course, in relationships and intimacy and marriage, and there's so much out there right now on like attachment theory and how do you build safe connections with a partner. And I just see this as the same thing. It's like the inner and the outer, it's the same, right? It's like how do we build our own tolerance, our own skill set to be able to, you know, um, face someone or a group where we don't agree, where we can still be friendly, enjoy the process of, teasing out an argument or a point. Um, so I think somewhere along the way, we just have kind of lost that art. We've lost that value. And, I think schools are a part of that, probably a big part of that, right? I don't think we can ask all parents to just suddenly get on board and develop a certain way of parenting, right? So I think schools can be the place
Yeah.
where we teach this skill and this value and model how it can be like fun and interesting. And I think that would have really transformative effects, not only societally, but even interpersonally, right? Like how cool if you
Yeah.
could integrate, a really important skill set that would help people in their friendships, their workplace relationships, their intimate partnerships.
Yeah. That's why I really did enjoy the chapter on debating, and talk to many different coaches who debate people, and you really get the sense of you are almost forced to take different perspectives when you have to debate, and so there's only nuance there, right? There's no right or wrong answer. There's no So you have to look at issues from multiple perspectives, and also to take other people's perspective because you're trying to convince them, right? Or trying to argue for in favor of a certain issue. And so that part was great. The one thing that I loved also seeing was the chapter on humor and comedy. And I wanted to tie those two together, because in the debate, you talk about how it builds all these skills of, like learning to hear other sides and taking others' perspectives. Um, and so I did a bit of improv, and I feel like there are two sides, there are two strategies for achieving maybe some of the same things, where
Mhm.
in debate you say no, but, and then you state your thing, whereas in improv you say yes and then you make, take the conversation in a different direction, but it's done with this sense of play that you also talk about that we might be missing. But it also builds, listening skills and empathy and taking other people's perspectives. So my question to you would be, do you think that if we approach it from that, like improv of trying to work together in a playful manner, where we're also building these skills of empathy and perspective taking, are we missing something if we don't go the debate route?
That's a great question. I love that. Yeah, it is kind of all pointing to some like feeling, I would say. And I have to say it's kind of strange to actually take the time to spell this out, like even on the page or whatever, because I think for some of us, we have kind of like a what you call like a felt sense of it. Like it's like something that I think some of us actually did experience growing up. And so we it feels like even though I didn't have a lot of like debate and like intense disagreement, I was surrounded by really intense like array of diversity all around me, my neighborhood, my school. And so that was very normal to me, right? And so with
Okay.
that does come like clash of opinions. I didn't see like, very university level, like high level debating of these things, but it was definitely just in the air at all times. Like this character's walking that way, this character's on the bus, like it was just everywhere. So, I think that you're right that there's a kind of playfulness to it. There's also this quality of like being able to bounce back from things, right? It's almost like a kinetic sort of like a movement feeling of like maybe you saw that in improv, right? Like you feed off
Yeah.
of each other's like physicality too, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
what I talk about in the book is like you know, what are we risking if we don't want to feel offended at all, right? And that's like very scary, right? And so like building up the ability to be maybe slightly offended here and there and like just kind of be okay and bounce back and value the all the other stuff, value the connection, value the laughter, value the jokes, value being with a group, and everyone has to decide what the line is for them. And I talk about that in the book too. Like
Yeah.
no one's asking you to stay at the comedy show. Like if it's too much,
Right.
just leave, right? Or you can change the channel. Um, so yeah, I mean, we are talking about a cultural shift that has to happen. And I think that comedy and debate can both be part of that and play a really pivotal role. And it was so fun to write about that stuff.
Yeah, no, I thought it was great. And I think I made a note at some point in the book. I'm like, what's missing is talk about humor. And then I was like, oh, here's a chapter. So I was really happy to see that, because I think it's also such a great tool for building social connection with, right? If you laugh with people, if you can make like it's hard to feel comfortable around people if you can't joke around them. So I feel like it really gets in the way if you have to walk on eggshells and you can't make a joke. And sometimes, it's a miss. Sometimes, it will not land. Sometimes you will offend people, but you have to be able to push those boundaries to see where the boundaries are for other people. So I feel like people are so afraid to just joke with others, to even give compliments, and just, engage with others in this authentic way that I think is really tragic. Because I think humor, you can also I think it makes it so much easier to have difficult conversations if there's humor involved because it lightens the tension.
Mhm.
You talk a lot about physiology and how it affects. It really does help to be able to, lighten the tension a little bit. It makes having difficult conversations a lot easier.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah. So, I mean, I think, researchers have looked at that, like the historical role or the evolutionary role that humor played in how, like, making people feel at ease. And, it can be like, can make a mate more attractive, right? Like, seeing someone who has like a lot of ease
Oh,
and can facilitate
right,
their way through a tense situation, it's so important.
right. Yeah. So there's an and phrase in your book that is really great that a lot of people have touched on, but I want you to explain because I think it's great that identity orphans,
Mm.
and I'm loath to identify as anything, but that part resonated with me. So do you want to tell us about that, like what it means and who these
Yeah,
people are?
yeah. Yeah, so this term just kind of like came to me because I was trying to name like what is this what I was seeing with all these kind of emerging heterodox thinkers and then my own experience of just feeling like um because I grew up with so much difference all around me and that was my norm. I never kind of grabbed on to like one group and so I just named this like identity orphan, meaning that like there's so many of us out there who don't feel attached to one very well defined identity group. And so the analogy of like orphan is almost kind of like, we're leaving it behind, we're casting it aside, we're sort of like detached in a way, right? Like something is dying. And you know, there's kids who grew up on military bases in foreign countries. There's, so many people who could speak to the experience of being bicultural, biracial, where, these sort of like nuanced experiences of having to put on different hats and sort of like see things with different lenses is a very beautiful thing and adds so much complexity to the way people think. And I just think that that's what we need more of. And it's such a shame that that kind of nuance has been shut out, right? Like from media narratives, Hollywood, pop culture,
Right.
obviously like university campuses and across the board. So it was just kind of a term that I thought captured this a little bit. And, in the book, I obviously profile a lot of people who feel similarly.
Yeah. And I think the point that you make about maybe maintaining a certain amount of fluidity, because we're all, a collection of all these identities. And it doesn't mean you have to check one box at all times, right? That you take on different roles as you're interacting with different people in different settings, right? The way you would interact with your parent is different than what you interact with your best friend. That's not natural and normal. And that we should, yeah, I think it's so constricting when you have to be boxed into one identity group at all times. And I think social media sort of perpetuates that, which is not great.
Yeah.
So speaking about labels, there's identity orphans. There's all these other terms that get used, and they're really useful and helpful. But I want to hear your thoughts on how maybe sometimes with pop psychology and a lot of like psychological literature and terms that go out into the culture, on one hand, there is the benefit that it allows us to speak about things, right? Name things that haven't been named before, maybe find other people who share similar experiences, and it gives people the vocabulary to sort of express their internal lives in a way that's just a bit more articulate and people know what you're talking about. But on the other hand, we also see, a plethora of terms that are now getting thrown around, willy-nilly. We have, things like microaggressions and trauma, and all these other phrases that come from, gaslighting and, everybody's a narcissist now. So there's that risk of, on one hand, it's great that we want to give people the tools to speak to each other and have the vocabulary to have these conversations. But on the other hand, some of it gets, bastardized or some of it just gets overused and loses its real meaning.
Yeah, this was so fun to dig into because my first book was all about neurodiversity, which, technically is neurological diversity. It's not meant to be like a synonym for one diagnosis. And so I Um, I have a lot of thoughts about where that research has gone in recent years. Um, so that would be like a whole nother conversation. Yeah, I mean, since I have this longstanding interest in psychology and have really kind of chronicled the field, and it's like you can hold space for both, right? Like you can see, like you said, like it's so um it's helpful, it's empowering that people are learning about these terms, and it's kind of become part of like our just everyday vernacular. Um, at the same time, yes, it sort of starts to lose all meaning, or people they grab onto these terms as a way to attempt vulnerability, but it's not real
Mm,
vulnerability. And so I do talk about that in the book a lot. Like I think where we
right.
really need to get to with free speech and with pop psychology is people being in touch with their own inner experience, right? Their emotions, their body, right? And I think that it's just it's it's still a problem if someone is going to all these other terms, whether it's a diagnostic category or a term like, oh, that person's just a narcissist, right? It's like if there's still not a wrestling with that person's own internal insides, right? Like, what is happening with me? How can I think through this? Um, how can I logically engage with my own thinking? How can I be a critical thinker of my own beliefs or my behaviors, how I'm contributing to a situation? So I think that's my concern, right? Like we've seen this progress, this wave of information, which is good. Like it helps people move forward. But the ultimate goal is to be able to wrestle with our own selves. And like I was saying at the beginning of our conversation, trusting your mind is really more like an aspiration. It's a destination that we get to. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this topic, both from like my first book and then obviously with the second one.
Yeah, maybe that's the topic of the third book. But
Yeah.
let me ask a final question that touches on what you were talking about before we open it up to Q&A. So yeah, the book really talks a lot about people understanding, sort of taking the time to, you know, think for themselves and also understand what their internal lives are and becoming really grounded in who they are. And I love this part because it's not a connection I'd made. If we are to overcome self-silencing, we must become better investigators of truth and reality. And that requires developing the skills to look internally and parse through our contributions to our own suffering, what suffering is results of other actions, and what negative feelings are simply mundane. Da, da, da. But I really like this part of, yes, the part of getting over self-silencing is really truth-seeking, which, is sort of the sort of North Star for academia, especially and important for universities. But it's a lot of these recommendations you have and the sort of the sort of suggestions you're offering people to do this work. It's really hard, right? It's really hard to do. It takes a lot of work. And if you really sit down and think about what do I believe and what are my values, instead of just adopting it from other people or other groups, it's a lot of hard work and people don't want to do hard work. So it's like doing math, right? Yeah, I feel like everybody knows that it's good for you. It's probably good for your mind, but it's really hard to do and we don't want to do it. So how do you yeah, like how do we get people past that where they realize the value in doing it and for thinking for yourself and evaluating, different ideas, different propositions for themselves?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that, I mean, there's a few angles there, right? I think like for some people, um, I talk about religion a lot in the book, and I think that's something that people can relate to. There's a lot of people who are raised with a certain ideology or religion or even a political party that, as they get older, doesn't feel like the right fit for them, right? And so then there's a whole process there. Like how do you pull away? How do you start to figure out your own thoughts, your own feelings? Because you've spent your whole life immersed in like this sort of one way of thinking, right? So some of this happens naturally for people, right? Like they want to pull away, they want to disengage. And so a book like this is very helpful in that way because it sort of explains what's going on. It echoes, frankly, a lot of the loneliness that people can go through. Um,
Right.
so you can also sort of see the parallels there with like a relationship, right? Like maybe someone is in a relationship where they don't feel fully empowered. They don't really know how to speak their mind. They don't know how to engage. They don't know how to tolerate a level of conflict. Maybe they would like to figure that out. I towards the end of the book, I do talk about how my husband's an engineer and he has a PhD, and I felt like actually it was like kind of hard to keep up with him sometimes. So like I felt like I had to really like kind of up level. So writing this book really helped me in that way. Um, so I think there's some natural motivation there that people find themselves in, right? The other route is like you said in the beginning, doing this young. If this kind of work was introduced
Hmm.
at the high school level and it's just sort of
Right.
part of class, then you're not waiting for someone to develop the motivation, right?
Yeah. It
So
just becomes part of your, mental world that this is just something you do.
yeah, yeah, but I agree it's hard, but I think as people grow and they're feeling frustrated with something, there's usually some kind of catalyst there where people are like, okay, I need to figure out my own insides.
Yeah. Um, and if you don't do it, I think that would be one way to encourage people to do it, right? If you don't, then you end up feeling isolated and self-silencing, right? Then you don't have that grounding to be able to um, interact with the world in an authentic way. So, yeah,
Yeah,
great.
that's true. Great. Hmm.
Thanks, Janara. So let's open it up to questions from the audience. You can either put it in the chat or just raise your hand and speak up.
Yeah, it's always interesting hearing questions.
Well,
Hello.
oh, yeah, my question is, how do you think we should deal with intolerant ideologies in people without creating a self-silencing culture?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I just couldn't hear you totally.
All right. How do you think we should deal with intolerant ideologies and people without creating a self-silencing culture?
Without, how do we tolerate different ideas without furthering self-silencing? Did I hear that right?
No, deal with intolerant ideologies, like authoritarianism who want to silence the opposition, like stuff like that. How do we deal with intolerant ideologies that do want to silence others without creating a self-silencing culture?
Mm. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, this is a hard one, right? Like, we can't just manufacture the circumstances where everyone is going to be on the same page about this, right? Like, there does have to be some basic level of agreement or dedication among the various parties, whether we're talking about two individuals or a professor in a classroom. There has to be something mutual there in terms of like, yes, we're curious about the other. We're open-minded. We want to have a conversation. I mean, if you're dealing with someone who is completely closed off and doesn't show any indication of maybe having their mind changed or their perspective changed, that is a hard one. It's not something that I looked at in this book. Like I think there's other books out there about, negotiating with terrorists or, things like that. I did look a little bit at extremism and fanaticism in the book, but not necessarily how to engage, more around like how does group identity form, what makes people vulnerable to becoming so fanatical about something. Um, yeah, so I'm not sure if I can wholly answer that question.
Thank you.
Okay, let me ask. Oh, let- let's see. We have something from Howard. It's here at Berkeley. I feel like the lack of critical thinking skills will be difficult to change. If you're 10, 15 years into academic cancel culture and now at a point where critical thinking skills are on the decline, how long do you think it will take to turn this around? If it's even possible to turn it around.
Yeah, it's a great
Yeah.
question. And I'm sorry to hear that. I know things are hard right now. The one thing I can think of, like when I was writing my first book, which was all about neurodiversity and research on women and things like that, was just this really interesting finding that it takes like about 20 years for new research, among scientists to be like implemented like on a mainstream level in the public. And I wonder if there's a parallel there, right? Like there's this huge reckoning right now with social scientists around the perils of group ideology and what's happening on campuses. So I wonder if we could almost mark in time, like when there's been sort of like a consensus formed around this, like, okay, we're in some kind of crisis, a crisis of open-mindedness, right? And then looking down the road, like how long will it take for the sort of academic culture to change? That would be one way to think about this. Maybe we're talking about a 20-year time frame. That doesn't sound too off to me. Smriti, do you have thoughts since you're in academia?
Um, gosh, my recommendation is always if there's one course I think we should mandate in college, it's logic.
Mm,
I remember taking a course on logic and critical thinking. So my minor was in philosophy. And I did mostly logic, and I thought it was so useful. It's nothing quite like anything that gets taught anywhere else because you have both language, but you use it in a way that's sort of more rule-based and mathematical, and you're taught to look at an argument, really break it down, right? What are the premises? What are the conclusions? And you're taught to do this in this very, formal sort of structured way, devoid of any controversial content. But I think building those skills of how do you look at an argument, how do you identify assumptions, I think that can be really important. So that would be my recommendation. I know it's not a great recommendation, but I really think, taking a little bit of, yeah, thinking about logic and teaching people logic in a formal way could be useful, but it's not a great recommendation. I do think it's really, really hard, um, especially when you have just like you mentioned in the book, just teaching critical thinking and teaching these mental tools is not easy. Even people who might be great at doing it in their own work are like have struggled with teaching it. So I don't
yeah.
think it's an easy task. And sometimes you see, you would think that academics would be good at this stuff, but then they fall into the same traps when you see them interacting with each other or with, you know, um, even in their own disciplines, but also with other academics and, faculty meetings or whatever. So I'm like, yeah, I think, yeah, we might just be doomed. I don't know.
Oh God.
Sorry.
But maybe that's just like the nature of society and like evolution and history and like how things move, right? It's just sort of like these like tectonic plates, like it just like is this very incremental process of like tension and there's conflict and um yeah, I don't know. I think we gradually move forward with these things, but I think like some people see it as more urgent than others.
Yeah. So Anna, you have a question. Feel free to, yeah, sorry, I didn't realize there was no raising hand button, but please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, how are you? Um, it's so good to be here. Thank you so much for hosting this meeting and for joining us and for speaking to us. Um, I guess my question is more of a conversation. It goes back into um, your first book, which talks so much about well, for me, I felt it as like self-analyzing and also really connecting with the things that really felt for me personally feeling so detached from the world and my personal experience, where my life is, where it's a long story, but I was led to surrender my life to God, as a creative visual storyteller, fashion designer, and hairstylist. But had this connectiveness to love and humanity and compassion and empathy. But I did not feel that all around me. And the more that I'm connecting with myself, especially with meeting women as yourself, scientists, neurologists, neuroscientists, psychologists, therapists who are women to understand the woman form and the anatomy, who is different than a man, to coexist together, but we some of us are just more like just aware to feel more without words, without articulating. And I think a huge thing about the disagreement with, like, you guys were speaking about debating, and I think it's the thing of, for some reason everyone feels like they have to agree with the same thing, but it's not. I don't believe in that either, but it's also a way that we can encourage each other to um progress with our thinking. But even me having this conversation now, like you guys were speaking about academics and having these like really intellectual conversations, sometimes it feels nerve-wracking when there's eyes on you, when you're speaking to somebody that wrote a whole book that talks about this, and then you want to say so much that it kind of feels like you go back to your comfort of like, well, this is what's coming to me now, because there's so much time and then limited time where we can't have these conversations. So I think it just goes back to listening and having compassion and empathy, and really listening with our bodies. Like there's a word that I remind myself of called Shema, which is listening, but to like listen with everything, with like what you're hearing, with what you're feeling, and then to not react to it, but to understand it before reacting, which again sometimes can be so difficult because things move so fast. So what
It's interesting. It sounds like you're sort of merging some of the concepts from our conversation today, and perhaps from my first book about sort of the role of the trait of sensitivity, which is what I did a lot of my research on for my first book, which is, there is this common theme between the two books, which is like people who see things sort of like in complex ways, and making space for that, right? And so in the first book, there's a lot of focus on psychology and psychiatry and how people kind of get marginalized for that.
Mm,
And the second book is really like completely normalizing that and saying, hey, look, like there's actually a ton of complex independent thinkers out there. This is not just like a psychiatric thing. This is very much just like, how do we hold space for giftedness and complexity and people who have kind of an allergy to groupthink? So I love that you're bringing up that there's different ways to process information. I think you're right that it can be hard for people to speak openly or present themselves. If you're talking about a group of academics or people who are not academics, and how do we sort of how do we hear each other? How do we listen to each other? I thought perhaps what you were going to say was like the process of engaging with difference and disagreement and risking tension and conflict there can be
mm,
very overwhelming for people,
mm,
like physiologically for their nervous system. And I think that is something that I would love to see explored out there by, scientists and researchers, and that is actually the challenge a lot of times. And I think, frankly, a lot of women are not really trained for that, right? That's seen as kind of like this scary, aggressive thing. So what I would love to see is people not seeing it as scary and not shying away from it. And that's, part of why I wrote the book, is like, how do we equip ourselves? So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Thanks for chiming in.
no,
Yeah.
that's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. There's definitely maybe a gender component, especially in the heterodox space. You do see maybe fewer women, and women maybe less likely to speak up because, yeah, challenging somebody is seen as a very aggressive act. So it can
Yeah.
be a bit of an issue. But I do want to ask the question that Zara asked. Thanks, Zara, from UK. Zara says, I work as a therapist with adults, children, and young people, and feel that the groupthink is endemic in the younger population and is a key stressor in their lives. It has become like a critical parent. It feels like it is subduing their ability to grow and have their own voices for the fear of being the outliers. And Zara works mainly with neurodivergent folks. Parents are battling this to help them develop their own minds too, and I hear them feeling powerless. So do you have, yeah, thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I don't have the context for this, so I don't know exactly like which aspect of groupthink that we're talking about. I can say broadly that, yeah, I think young people, unfortunately, are so pulled into this. I talk in the book a lot about the role of social media and algorithms and how, um, the way these platforms are designed, they're meant to suck you in and stoke outrage and reinforce a very particular worldview, right? And so young people are so vulnerable to this. And you mentioned working with neurodivergent kids, and so that conversation can go many directions, right? Are people overdiagnosing themselves? Are people thinking that they are neurodivergent in some way because they're overexposed to these algorithms? Are the parents getting behind that blindly and not challenging that at all? This is a conversation I'm very happy to have, and I think there hasn't been a lot of nuance on this. Um, and the book itself was very nuanced. It was not pro diagnosis, but these concepts have really taken hold in the mainstream, and people have just become obsessed with the diagnosis, which was really never the point. The point is really just self-awareness, self-knowledge. If you need a diagnosis, okay, fine. Accommodations for school or for workplace, like that's fine. But that doesn't mean that everybody's autistic. That doesn't mean that everybody has ADHD. And I think it's fine that people have these labels, and it's so helpful to understand ourselves. But do we need, thousands of clinics popping up that are making money off of diagnosing people? No, like that's really not the point. So I'm happy to get into all of that. And I think it must be really hard and scary for parents right now. So yeah.
Hmm. Thanks, Sarah. So we have a question from John Keller. I experienced a kind of groupthink, identity politics, and cancel culture when I went to college in the late 80s. I recall feeling pressure to self-silence. The term then was political correctness. I remember reading and enjoying Closing of the American Mind. So seems like it's been a problem for much longer than 10, 15 years and predates social media, at least on university campuses. How much have things changed? Are they even worse now?
Such a good question. Yeah, I think a lot of us have thought about this. I mean, I was a kid in the 80s, so I can't really speak to it in a super intelligent way. But yeah, I think the PC thing has always been there, right? It's sort of like a way to like show that you're in the know, or people call that like virtue signaling now.
Right.
It would be hard to sort of like measure if it's worse. I mean, I'm sure somebody's looking at that. It does seem like it's just a continuation of the same thing. I feel like Jonathan Rausch, I think he writes on this topic, and he's been writing on this for like decades. So maybe he would be a good resource. Or Smriti, I don't know if you've seen any numbers on this.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's possible to get numbers on this, but I can tell you anecdotally. So, through my work at Heterodox Academy at Berkeley, I met this faculty member who was actually he was in his 90s by the time we met, and so he had been here during the free speech movement, and he was in the English department, and he mentioned that he retired early back in the 80s because he felt this as well. So I think you're right to say that some of this was happening even back then. I think there was a new wave of sort of postmodernism, and especially maybe it was worse in some departments. I think it's been late to come to other departments like STEM. I think so. It is worse now because I think it's more widespread. Back then, it may have been limited to certain departments, like maybe, yeah, like English or, social welfare. I'm not sure. So anecdotally, I think it's a much it's probably been happening for a long time where people feel like they couldn't speak up because of they belong to a certain identity category, um, and that saying certain things would, yeah, and maybe not get them canceled back then, but that it was not politically correct and they would, be sort of sanctioned socially for it. Um, I do think it has gotten worse again because we're seeing the conversation across academia now. And I think that now there's there's a lot more of treating students like customers where and even right like your sort of your evaluation and your tenure and promotion sort of depend on, for example, partly on student evaluation. So you have to be really careful about what to say because otherwise that could affect your student evaluation. So I think I definitely think it's gotten worse. And a lot of this trend of political correctness, of maybe, self-silencing, has seeped into other departments that maybe wasn't in traditionally, but I'm not sure if there are data on it. Although fire does conduct surveys, but they didn't exist in the 80s, so it's hard to compare. But
Yeah, great question.
okay, and we're right on time. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for the great conversation, Jenara. It's always lovely to speak with you.
Thank
Yeah.
you for having
Thanks,
me.
Carla. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, have a great one.